Welcome back to Church Ed Vasey on Times Radio. We're still joined by the Times columnist Libby Purves and by Robin Brandt, who used to be the BBC political correspondent and then covered China, based in Shanghai. Now, we are, I'm afraid, going to have to talk about Liz Truss. There's been a huge serialisation of the Anthony Seldon book over the weekend. His new book is Truss at 10. In fact, I think Anthony Seldon is coming on the show at the end, and I'll ask him, in fact, how big the book is. It may only be a sort of 50-page book. In today's Times, he's writing about the moment at conference when she U-turned on her promise to abolish the 45p income tax rate.
The fact is that the abolition of the 45p tax rate became a distraction from the major parts of our growth plan. That is why we're no longer proceeding with it. I get it, and I have listened.
She listened. Anthony Seldon writes with classic understatement today that there has never been a premiership like that of Liz Truss. Is it actually worse than we all thought? Libby, what was, in terms of revelations, what insights have you gained so far, perhaps from reading the Seldon serialisation?
Dear Anthony Seldon, headmaster to all prime ministers, you know, the end-of-term reports they get from him. I've been reading it in very small doses so as not to have to lie whimpering behind the sofa. As someone said, she should get an award for the first woman in public life not to have imposter syndrome. But today, the account of the sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng, her chancellor, is just extraordinary and upsetting to a woman because the sense of panic and emotional lack of control that is reported makes you wince because it's all the stuff that people accuse women of. Suddenly this complete meltdown that he reports, or I mean, I hope it's true, I don't know whether it's true, is just sort of shattering, really, the headmaster's report. As I say, I can't read much of it at a time, I get upset.
Well, we don't want to upset you, Libby. I mean, it is interesting, Anthony Seldon. I may ask him about this. He's hit, you know, on a personal level, he's hit a real rich seam, and certainly the Tories have rewarded him in spades because he did Cameron at 10, which was a pretty insightful book. But then, of course, we kept giving him new prime ministers. So then he was able to do May at 10, Truss at 10, Johnson at 10. He's come out with this verdict, apparently, that Boris Johnson was a worse prime minister than Liz Truss, which is interesting. Robin, what were your insights from reading the serialisation?
Well, I mean, I, like Libby, find it quite kind of traumatic to kind of read the commentary and the insights and the revelations. For me, the most important thing in terms of a Truss premiership is not just its longevity, but the impact on the reputation, not just of her, but those around her. I mean, look, the electoral defeat obviously has been vastly analysed and reported, but look at the reputation that those who worked with her and around her are having to deal with on a personal level. A couple of former cabinet ministers no longer in politics are spoken to in the last couple of weeks before people headed off on holidays, and for them it's a deeply personal problem, isn't it? And the reputations that they feel they are left with, even with those who were perhaps some of the most effective communicators, the most effective managers of their departments, their personal reputation. And we read a lot, don't we, about the personal reputations of celebrities, film stars, politicians. That, for me, is the kind of ultimate, or one of the ultimate gauges of the impact of the Truss premiership and the Truss administration. Not the reputation so much on the party as they continue to go through their decision on what comes next anyway, but on some of these people who worked with her and were loyal to her, and their personal reputations are just in bits. And I think for them, the personal crusade to try and to repair that, to reconstruct that, is perhaps one of the most interesting kind of fallouts from that premiership in particular, because it was so fatally kind of destructive, wasn't it?
It's an interesting point. Libby, I think you're going to get quote of the week for the only woman who doesn't have imposter syndrome. But even
it wasn't me said it first, sadly.
What is even more fascinating is that it's carried on after her premiership. I mean, she's now got this kind of an American lecture tour where she's doubling down on Trump. She's doubling down on her belief that her agenda was the right belief. It was just communicated badly. I mean, in some ways, it's intensely admirable.
Well, it becomes a sort of freak show, really, doesn't it? It's a bit like Boris's tour. There's a wonderful expression used in the army, in officers' reports, as his men would follow him anywhere if only out of curiosity. And I think that's really where we are now with both Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. Sort of what the hell next? What on earth will they get up to next? But it is sad. I have to say, I felt for Kwasi Kwarteng's extraordinary statement that he was met at the airport by his first and last motorcade to bring him back. And during the motorcade, he read on Twitter that he'd been sacked.
That's right, famous.
And then an emotional, tears in her eyes, Prime Minister told him he was sacked, and he says, "Yeah, I read it on Twitter." I mean, this is no way to run anything. And I think, in a way, people like him, telling Seldon things like this, it sort of helps their own reputation, which is what Robin was just talking about. People are having to distance themselves. Yes, I worked there, but,
it's not all about us. It's not all about us on the Times, but I should point out that the tweet that Kwasi Kwarteng read in the motorcade was from Steve Swinson. So we're talking about Keir Starmer's speech. Phil has texted in, the Starmer speech is so leaked, it's completely devalued. Starmer is saying the usual self-serving waffle. We're going to hear he's going to talk about a decade of national renewal, i.e. he's going to need 2 terms in government. Robin, you used to be a political correspondent. What do you think about what you've read so far about Keir Starmer's speech?
Well, any incoming Prime Minister always wants more than the kind of statutory 5 years they're given, aren't they? I think in particular in this instance, the inheritance appears on so many levels to be such a relatively gloomy one, and the changes that this Labour government wants to institute do appear to be so structural that more than simply 5 years is what is required. But look, we talk in politics, don't we, about momentum, we talk about delivery, but also we talk about expectation management, don't we? And for me, this continues to be the latest chapter alongside the Chancellor Rachel Reeves in terms of that narrative of expectation management. And the expectations are such that it's going to take a long time to deliver beyond the kind of instant changes of changing planning reforms, of establishing great British energy. So for me, this is the latest chapter. I know we're only, 55 days into this administration when it comes to expectation management.
Well, you're keeping a count. 55 days. I didn't know that.
Well, that's because I saw kind of 50 plus something the other day, and I'm doing a little bit of bank holiday maths.
Because he's outlived Liz Truss. Libby, one of the things I read on Twitter about the speech, which I thought was sort of insightful, is there a danger that Keir Starmer is talking Britain down? I'm not saying that in a sort of cheap way, but if you keep going on about how messed up the country is, investors might start to take note.
I think he's trying to do what our builders are doing at the moment, which is tell us that he cannot take down the scaffolding and make less of a mess of the garden because all the window frames are rotten and there's stuff on the roof. But I think a certain amount of truth-telling goes down quite well because people can see things like the widening of the wealth and indeed sort of class gap, the problems on the streets, the closure of libraries, pools, public spaces, all the legacy of austerity. And then they also can see the Baroness Moan sort of cronyism and the disrespect of Partygate. So reminding people that there are problems to be fixed is fine, but the problem is we've got quite soon to see action. And I suspect the action that he's softening us up for is a budget which does land hard on all sorts of things like capital gains and inheritance taxes and making council tax fairer, so that people with big houses do pay more. I think we're being softened up for that, but people can see quite well that stuff needs doing, and I think him saying it is not a bad thing.
I love this image of Bob the Builder, Keir Starmer, sucking his teeth and saying, "Oh well, there's a bit of dry rot. Actually, we weren't expecting that. I've got to tell you." But
well, it's the fact there's going to be scaffolding for a while. There's going to be noise. There's going to be we can't open our bathroom window, and we'd really like to because of the scaffolding.
I think it's a great image.
But we've got to put up with it because he's building.
The other insight I saw was from an economist called Danny Blanchflower, who's a big Labour supporter, but saying he was hoping that Keir Starmer's speech would actually set out what Labour's secret plan was. I mean, I think, Robin, that was, again, you talk about the 55 days. This seems like an early speech for a reset, an early speech to set out the government's agenda, which perhaps, because of course they didn't really say anything during the election.
No, and that's what it is, isn't it? It's not so much a reset. It's we're out of the election campaign, obviously a hugely successful election campaign, and now to follow on from Libby has spoken about there, it's time for a bit of truth telling. It's time for the kind of the harsh realities. And let's remember, it's still very early days. I mean, as we know and has been much talked about, George Osborne and David Cameron continued that narrative in terms of blaming the previous administration, be that right or wrong, for a decade and maybe beyond. We're barely a few days in. And so the extent to which expectations are going to have to be managed at the same time as beginning to deliver, particularly on those mission-driven aims. But continuing the sense that it's not our fault, it's their fault, everything is their fault. I mean, in a way, that could be a perpetual part of the narrative, couldn't it?